My husband fled our fight, but the late-night call wasn't him. It was the Bureau, revealing he was intercepted dumping evidence connected to a massive city sabotage. Then, my mother-in-law drops the facade, shattering the myth of the grieving widow by throwing herself into the collapsing, electrified sinkhole under our backyard oak tree. The gravel of the driveway bit into my bare feet. I stood there, shivering in the thin summer dress I'd thrown on, watching the taillights of his truck shrink until they were just two angry red pinpricks swallowed by the merciless black of the interstate exit ramp. He didn't just leave, he fled. Fled from the screaming match. Fled from the fact that I'd finally said the unforgivable thing about his mother. "You're her puppet, Mark. You always have been." The silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the house, leaving me suffocating in the aftermath of a decade of suppressed resentment exploding all at once. My mother-in-law, Carol, was still standing on the porch, clutching her silk robe tighter, her face a mask of practiced, tragic victimhood. She hadn't stopped him. She hadn't even tried. She just stood there watching the drama unfold, knowing this was the climax she'd been orchestrating for years. "Well," she whispered, her voice sickeningly sweet, "I suppose this is what happens when you push a good man too far, isn't it, darling?" I wanted to scream, to throw the ceramic garden gnome she loved so much right through the picture window, but the shock had frozen the anger into something cold and heavy in my chest. I didn't speak to her. I couldn't. I turned and walked back into the house we'd built together, my half of it now, apparently, and locked myself in the master bathroom. I needed to breathe away from the scent of her expensive lavender soap and the lingering tension of Mark's heavy cologne. I sank onto the cool tile floor, scrubbing my face with my hands, trying to wash away the residue of the fight. It wasn't just about his mother's passive-aggressive comments anymore. It was about the foundation of our life, the trust that had cracked wide open. He'd driven off, probably heading to the run-down motel he always threatened to rent when things got tough, probably already texting me the apology that would smooth everything over for another 6 months. That was the cycle. I reached for my phone, my fingers numb, intending to text him something passive-aggressive about needing the spare key back. But as I looked at the screen, my heart skipped a beat. Not from a new message from Mark, but from an incoming call on my work line. I never got calls on the work line at 2 a.m. Hesitantly, I answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end wasn't Mark's. It was clipped, professional, and laced with an authority that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Is this Sarah Jenkins?" "Yes. Who is this?" I tried to sound steady, but my voice cracked on the last word. "Ms. Jenkins, this is Agent Davies from the State Bureau of Investigations. We need you to remain calm. We have your husband, Mark, in custody." My breath hitched. Custody? What in God's name? A fight over property lines and passive aggression did not land a man in custody. "What are you talking about? He just left. We had an argument." The agent paused, a heavy, deliberate silence that felt louder than any shout. "Ms. Jenkins, we are aware of the domestic dispute. However, Mr. Jenkins was intercepted by our surveillance team approximately 3 miles from your residence. He was driving erratically, and more importantly, he was attempting to dispose of evidence." My mind raced. Evidence? What evidence? He'd left in the truck with his wallet and his favorite worn-out baseball cap. That was it. "I don't understand," I whispered, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "What kind of evidence?" Agent Davies leaned into the receiver, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, chilling tone. "We found the lockbox he had hidden under the spare tire well in his truck bed, Sarah. And inside that box wasn't cash or jewelry. It was documentation relating to the major infrastructure failure that happened downtown last year, the one everyone blamed on poor maintenance. We have reason to believe your husband wasn't just an employee there. We believe he was the key facilitator." My entire world tilted. Infrastructure failure? That explosion that shut down the entire district for 3 months? It was ruled an industrial accident, a terrible, tragic miscalculation. That's That's insane, I stammered, feeling the room spin. Mark is an accountant. He organizes spreadsheets. He organized something much bigger, Ms. Jenkins, and here is the critical part. When we brought him in, he made one desperate phone call before we confiscated his device. He called a single number. Davy's voice hardened, turning glacial. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't call his mother. He called you. I stared at the phone, suddenly feeling a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Mark hadn't called me before he drove off. I was staring at my phone, waiting for his text. If he hadn't called me, who had he called? He didn't call me, I forced out. I'm telling you, he left. Ms. Jenkins, Davies said, a dark certainty in his tone. The record shows a 2-second outgoing call routed through a burner phone at precisely 2:17 a.m. It registered to your primary cell number, and when we subpoenaed the data logs from that burner phone, the location ping was not near the highway. It was pinging from a single, very specific address. The tile floor was freezing against my cheek, but a sweat broke out on my forehead. And where was that address, Agent? I managed to breathe out. There was a terrible, drawn-out sigh on the other end. It was pinging from the abandoned warehouse district, Sarah. The same district where the initial procurement paperwork for the industrial-grade thermite used in that explosion was traced back to. And Mr. Jenkins' last text message on that burner phone, before we shut it down, wasn't to a co-conspirator. He paused for the final devastating blow. It was a photo, Sarah. A photo of you sleeping peacefully in our bed, taken just an hour before he left your house tonight. The world went silent again, but this time it was the silence of sheer, paralyzing horror. A photo. Me, sleeping. Taken after he left, or taken before he left. But after he'd already decided to drive away and get intercepted. It meant he hadn't just fled a fight. He'd executed a plan. A carefully timed exit strategy connected to something far darker than marital discord. That's impossible, I whispered, scrambling backward until my back hit the cold porcelain of the bathtub. I was alone. After he left, I locked the door immediately. The photo timestamp is 1:45 a.m., Ms. Jenkins. 15 minutes before you claim he drove away after the argument, Agent Davies corrected, his voice devoid of sympathy. We need you to tell us right now who else was in your house when Mr. Jenkins left. Did anyone else have access to your room? Did anyone else know he was planning this whole elaborate departure? My mind flashed back to the driveway. Carol, my mother-in-law. She hadn't been inside crying. She'd been standing on the porch, watching, radiating that brittle satisfaction. She knew, or at the very least, she was complicit in his deception. My mother-in-law, I choked out. Carol Vance. She was there. She saw him drive off. Carol Vance, Davies repeated, the name sounding heavy and significant on his tongue. We are currently interviewing Mrs. Vance. She's being cooperative, stating she watched her son storm out after your vicious fight. But if she saw him leave, how did he manage to circle back to take that picture without you noticing? That was the crack in the logic. If he'd driven straight onto the highway, he wouldn't have been close enough, fast enough, to snap a picture of me sleeping and then also be intercepted 3 miles away heading in the opposite direction. Unless he never went toward the highway. My gaze snapped to the window. The driveway was dark, empty, but the path around the side of the house, the rarely used service gate leading to the overgrown backwoods. He didn't go toward the interstate, I realized aloud, the revelation hitting me with the force of a physical blow. He pulled out, drove down the lane, and cut through the woods. He circled back to the house. He had to have parked around the back. Why would he risk that, Sarah? To take a photo? Davies sounded impatient now. If he was trying to frame his departure as spontaneous rage, why risk exposure by coming back? Because the photo wasn't the point. The photo was the proof that he had successfully maintained the illusion of the domestic dispute right up until the moment he was intercepted by the Bureau. But if he risked coming back, it meant something else was waiting for him, something he needed to secure before the police arrived, something he couldn't carry in the truck that was about to be seized. Suddenly, a new memory surfaced. sharp and unwelcome. Last Tuesday. Mark had been agitated, pacing, claiming he needed to check the septic system access cover near the large oak tree in the far corner of the yard, the one Carol insisted on keeping, claiming it was sacred ground. He'd been gone nearly an hour, returning with mud on his boots and a strange look of triumph in his eyes. "The oak tree," I whispered, pushing myself up. "The old septic access panel by the property line. He was obsessed with checking it recently. Ms. Jenkins, you need to stay right where you are. We have units en route to your location now. Do not approach the property line." Davy's voice shifted, adrenaline clearly spiking on his end. But I couldn't wait. If Mark was connected to this massive industrial sabotage, this alleged attempt to cripple the city's infrastructure, and he'd hidden something in our yard, something important enough to risk being caught coming back for it, I had to see it first. Not for him, but for myself, to understand the monster I'd married. I ignored the frantic shouts from Davies. I flung open the bathroom door and sprinted down the hall. Carol was gone from the porch. She must have slipped back inside after his truck left, preparing her alibi. I didn't bother with shoes. My bare feet pounded across the polished wood floors toward the back door. I fumbled with the deadbolt, the heavy, expensive one Mark insisted we install, and burst into the cool night air. The beam of my phone flashlight cut a shaky swath across the lawn toward the massive, gnarled oak. There it was, the heavy, circular metal cover, slightly ajar just as he'd left it. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, something sharp. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the stinging dew soaking my dress. I gripped the rusted edge of the panel and hauled upward with a strength I didn't know I possessed. The metal screeched in protest, revealing a shallow, earthen pit beneath. And there, nestled in the dry soil, wasn't a bag of cash or a second burner phone. It was a single, thick, hard-bound ledger, wrapped tightly in clear plastic sheeting. It looked like a bank deposit book, but thicker, older. My heart hammered against my ribs as I ripped the plastic open. The first page was handwritten in Mark's neat accountant script, but this wasn't tax data. It was a detailed list of payments, coded dates, and names. Names I vaguely recognized. City council members, high-level executives at the Energy Commission, and... My eyes scanned down the list, searching for Carol's name, searching for anything that would explain why he was doing this. And then I saw it. 3 lines up from the bottom, circled in red ink, was a name that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a city official. It was the name of the lead investigator assigned to the industrial sabotage case, the man who had officially closed the file 6 months ago, declaring it an accident. Below that name, Mark had scrawled a single furious sentence. "They asked for too much. The deal is off." But that wasn't the worst part. As I looked closer at the ledger, noticing the strange watermarks on the paper, a tiny, almost invisible piece of folded paper slipped out from between 2 pages. It was a receipt for a prepaid burial plot at the very cemetery where my own parents were interred. Plots, I thought, were already paid for by my trust fund. The date on the receipt was from 3 years ago, before I could process the implication that Mark had been secretly managing my deceased parents' estate funds. I heard the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway behind me, not the smooth approach of a single sedan, but the heavy tread of multiple unmarked vehicles. "Sarah Jenkins, do not move. Put the ledger down." Davy's voice boomed, amplified by a bullhorn. I looked up, blinded by approaching spotlights, and in the glare, standing next to Agent Davies, looking completely composed, utterly serene, and holding a steaming mug of what looked like tea, was Carol Vance. She wasn't arrested. She was standing beside the law, an observer turned partner. "He was always so dramatic, darling," Carol sighed, shaking her head sadly at me. "But you didn't look closely enough at the paperwork, did you? Mark only bought those plots because I told him to. Your parents died because I made sure of it. And that ledger? That ledger is mine now." The spotlights pinned me against the base of the oak tree, turning the dewy grass into a blinding white stage. Carol stood bathed in the artificial light, sipping her tea, the picture of the grieving matriarch who had just weathered a terrible storm, except now She was standing shoulder to shoulder with the federal agent leading the investigation into her son. "What are you talking about, Carol? Mark didn't drive off to start this investigation. He drove off because you pushed him to it," I screamed, clutching the ledger to my chest like a shield. The realization that my mother-in-law was not just a passive manipulator, but a criminal mastermind, one who likely orchestrated my parents' demise, was a physical poison flooding my system. Agent Davies stepped forward, his face grim but his posture rigid, clearly torn between his duty and the sudden, horrifying pivot of the entire case. "Ms. Jenkins, we need that ledger. It contains information regarding multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit widespread sabotage and large-scale financial fraud involving state assets." He gestured toward Carol. "Mrs. Vance has confirmed that Mr. Jenkins was attempting to leave town with stolen property, this ledger, and that she contacted us immediately when he fled." Carol gave a slow, almost theatrical nod of agreement. "He tried to cut me out, Agent. After all these years of planning, he thought he could take the proof and run. But the receipt, the burial plot receipt for my parents, burned under my fingertips. Mark might have been a complicit accountant in his wife's schemes, but he had clearly just made a desperate move against his own mother. He hadn't called the authorities on me. He had called them on her, trying to secure the evidence that implicated her in my parents' deaths before she could silence him completely. He didn't flee from me, Agent Davies," I managed to gasp out, ignoring Carol's sharp intake of breath. "He fled for me. He was bringing you the proof that she killed my parents and framed the city explosion to cover her tracks and drain the trust funds." I hurled the ledger at Davies' feet. The impact cracked the old plastic wrapping, and several pages fluttered loose onto the wet grass. Davies hesitated for only a fraction of a second, long enough for Carol to make her move. She dropped the teacup. The ceramic shattered like a gunshot. In one swift, practiced motion, Carol snatched something from the silk lining of her robe. It wasn't jewelry. It was a small, wicked-looking silver device. "You should have stayed inside, dear," Carol hissed, her face transformed from dignified matron to cold predator. She pressed a button on the device. Before Davies could react, the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate violently. It wasn't the vibration of a truck. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming coming from directly beneath the oak tree, beneath the open pit where the ledger had been hidden. "What is that?" Davies yelled, scrambling for his sidearm. "Insurance," Carol sneered. Mark was always terrible at following instructions. He thought he was just hiding documents. He didn't realize the actual trigger for the secondary breach was wired directly into the septic access point, set to detonate if tampered with after midnight. The thrumming intensified into a deafening roar. The earth around the oak tree began to split open, not from an explosion, but from a mechanical grinding. The heavy roots of the sacred tree were being ripped from the soil, revealing not more dirt, but polished high-grade steel casings sunk deep into the ground. The foundation of the entire backyard was compromised. "That's not a septic tank, is it, Carol?" I whispered, backing away, the sound of rending wood echoing around us. "It's the fail-safe for the city grid backup generator, you fool!" Carol screamed, finally losing her composure as the ground beneath her wobbled dangerously. If the initial sabotage wasn't enough, this brings down the entire power grid for a 3-county radius. Mark was going to expose me before I could initiate Phase 2. Now, thanks to your little dance, we all go down with the evidence. Davies immediately understood. He didn't look at me. He looked at Carol, then at the churning earth. He abandoned the ledger, drawing his weapon and leveling it, not at me, but at Carol Vance, who was now precariously balanced near the edge of the collapsing pit. "Mrs. Vance, step away from the destabilized area. This is your last warning." Carol let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, a sound of pure, maniacal frustration. She didn't move away from the edge. Instead, she took one last triumphant look at me, her eyes blazing with inherited madness. "Mark should have listened to his mother," she spat. Then, with a final surge of adrenaline, she didn't try to escape. She took a running leap directly into the widening fissure, disappearing instantly into the grinding darkness, taking her secrets and perhaps a piece of the neighborhood's power supply with her. The ground shuddered one last time, a terrible groan, and then the spotlights died. Everything plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. The only sound left was the rapid, panicked breathing of Agent Davies and my own desolate sob echoing in the sudden, total silence of the dead night. I was alive, Mark was gone, and the woman who killed my parents was buried under our manicured lawn, taking the entire electrical grid with her, and I was the one standing there, holding the receipt for my own parents' graves.